Awesome to hear. Let's go ahead and get going then. So before we start our lesson, I just wanted to share if you are looking for other free prep options. There's a couple that we offer. One is that you can try the first session of one of our real LSAT courses for free. So our LSAT classes are typically 10 sessions long, 3 hours each, and you can attend session 1 all 3 hours as a trial student for free. It's great because it's just an excellent lesson. That particular lesson focuses on logical reasoning and ordering games in logic games, but it also gives you a really good feel for what it's like to be a student in one of our classes. So if it's something you're considering, it's a great way to give it a shot. You can also try our online tool, which is called LSAT Interact, which is a comprehensive series of interactive LSAT curriculum taught by our instructors, but it's not live. It's pre-recorded and it adapts to your responses. So like if you do a question and you say answer C, it will tell you if you got it right or wrong and ask you how you'd like to proceed in terms of feedback. So the web address is there if you'd like to learn more about any of those. So let's talk about our focus for today. So today we're going to be working on 3D ordering games, which is the name that we at Manhattan Prep use for a particular type of logic game. And if you haven't been studying with us, you've been studying with someone else or studying on your own, you may have found it called something different than that, and that's totally okay, but I'll try to make it very clear what this type of game is, and we're going to talk about tools for approaching those games and how to work through some of the questions. We're going to start with a fairly sort of standard 3D ordering game to kind of get a sense of where everybody is starting from and make sure we all are have the same basic knowledge. And then if time allows and if everybody wants to, I have a more challenging 3D ordering game that we can work on. So we can talk more about what exactly I mean by 3D ordering in just a minute, but I think it might be best to actually just kind of dive in and give you an opportunity to try this game out and see how everybody does. So here is the game. What I'm going to ask you to do is on your own paper at home to take some time to diagram this however you would, and then try question number 1. And when you have finished with question number 1, send me a chat with your answer. If you don't want to send your answer to everyone, you can change the to button in the chat from all panelists to just me. And then I'll be the only one who can see it. I'm going to give you about 4 minutes to work on diagramming and doing the first question. And then after that time is up, I'll check in with you and we'll do some review. I'm going to hop off camera while you are doing that so that I am not staring you down and freaking you out. But I will be timing and I'm right here just waiting for you to finish. All right, give it a shot. Good luck. All right, that's 4 minutes. If you are finished, go ahead and throw your answer in. I would love to also hear just like a quick note from you about how you felt about this game. Did it feel challenging? Did it feel kind of medium? Did it feel pretty easy for you? Where did you feel like you were at? And if you haven't gotten a chance to answer the question, you can also just let me know. I'm still working. Okay, cool. Thank you, Anna and Kaylee. Let's go ahead and talk about this game in terms of its diagram and where it fits into the big picture of logic games in general. So anytime I start a logic game, I think of it in terms of, is this game an ordering game or a grouping game? So in general, the vast majority, I'd say 99% of logic games are going to ask you to put things in order, put things in groups, or possibly both. So the first thing I think about is which of those things is this game asking me to do? For this particular game, I know that it's asking me to put things in order for a couple of reasons. First, it's got a rule that tells me one of these houses is going to be shown before the other, one of these is going to be shown after the other. The second is that we're dealing with the element of time, which is a sort of a general hint that it's likely that this is going to be an ordering game. Once I know that it's an ordering game, I start thinking about what would be the best sort of tool for me to use for this ordering game. And one of the questions that I ask myself when trying to decide that is, does this ordering game involve any subgroups? So is this just like a string of 7 letters and I need to put them in the order and that's all I need to worry about? Or are they somehow divided in a particular way? In this case, we have some subgroups. So we're told that we're going to have this day divided up into morning, afternoon, and evening. And that means that I need to account for that in some way on my diagram. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways that we could account for subgroups here. We can do it using the 3D ordering diagram that I mentioned. We can also do it just using some more informal techniques. So go ahead and we make our number line, number all of our spaces. Like I got one too many space. And one way that we could handle these subgroups is just to go ahead and, oh, I think my numbering's a little bit off. I'll fix that in just a second. But we would go ahead and say, all right, houses 1 and 2 are in the morning, so I'm just going to draw a line for that. 3, 4, and 5 are in the afternoon. I'll draw a line for that. And then 6 and 7 are going to be in the evening, so we will draw a line for that to separate it out. And that would allow us to kind of easily visualize these distinctions between morning, afternoon, and evening. Another way that we could approach this is to use a 3D ordering diagram. When you do a 3D ordering diagram, you just add a second layer on top of the first one. This is really helpful when you have to sort of label each of the elements on your number line. So for example, if they said, 3 of these houses are urban and 3 of these houses are in the suburbs and 3 of them are rural, and we don't know which one is which, then we might add a second layer to classify them. In this case, since we kind of already know, we can just put like M and M for morning and A's for afternoon and E's for evening, and that would also be a way to handle the subgroup. And when we do that, we label this 3D ordering. Did anybody have a different way of handling the morning, afternoon, and evening that they want to share? If so, you can just drop it in the chat. If not, give me a smiley face. I'll know we can move on. Okay, cool. All right, so we've got our bank, we've got a good sort of starter diagram, and then we need to go through our rules. I'm going to talk you through just how I would add these to my diagram, and then I'm going to ask you to share some inferences with me. So first rule, J must be shown in the evening. You've got kind of two options for that. One is to put J in the evening spaces. If you do that, you want to be careful to make it clear to yourself that you don't know which evening space J is in. One way you can do that is with this sort of cloud of mystery, so just putting a circle around it that goes from space 6 to 7. You might also put like a J with a slash in space 6 and a J with a slash in space 7, and that could show the same thing. Another way to show that same rule is to do some cross-offs. So putting underneath all the spaces where J cannot go, just a J with a slash through it. And sometimes it's nice to do both. K cannot be shown in the morning. We can definitely handle with some cross-offs. For that one, we could think about putting a cloud, but there's so many spaces that K could go in that it might not be my best move. I don't know if it's in the afternoon or the evening. And then L is sometime after K and sometime before M. So for this type of rule, I'm going to just use the notation where I have some dashes to separate these letters. So L is after K, L is before M. I use kind of a long dash, not an underscore, because if I were to say like K underscore M, to me that means something different. It means like K is separated by one space from M, and I want to be really clear. All right, so I've got all my rules on the board. One of the biggest steps that I love to reinforce with logic games is that it's really important before you go into the questions to make inferences. So I would love to hear what are some inferences that you made before you started the questions about where certain letters must go or cannot go. Can you tell me anything about that beyond what the rules say? Just tell me in the chat if you've got some. Okay, so Kaylee is saying L can't go in 3 or 7. I love that. So we're looking at L has to come after K. If K can't be in 1 or 2, then we wouldn't be able to put L in 3. We actually also wouldn't be able to put L in 1 or 2. So I would add a little cross off of L there, because if L were in 1 or 2, then K would not be able to come before it. And L can't go in 7. Awesome. So we call this a falling off the end inference, which is if I were to put L in 7, then I have to put M after L, but M would then fall off the number line, which is not okay. Nice work, Kaylee. What are some other inferences that we could make here? There's a few more to be made, maybe along the same lines of that. Okay, so Kaylee's saying M has to go in 5, 6, or 7. That's absolutely right. So if we can't have L until until space 4 at the earliest, then the earliest place M could go is in 5, 6, or 7. Because that kind of straddles the groups, I might also just use cross-offs for this one, but you could consider making a cloud, whatever you think is going to make the most sense to you when you're sort of working through the game. Nice. Now, one other thing that I think about when I am sort of making these inferences is if I start to see a big pile of cross-offs under a couple of spaces, then I want to ask myself, okay, there's a bunch of letters that can't go there. What can go there? It might be helpful for me to know. So take a look at spaces 1 and 2 in particular. They've both got 4 letters crossed off. See if you can figure out and tell me what letters could go there. Nice, Johnny, love it. So Johnny says our floater is N-O-M-P. And we don't know which ones it'll be, so this is a tricky thing to notate. You could use a cloud and just put N-O-M-P and kind of keep in mind that, of course, it's only going to be 2 of those to go there. Anna, no problem. Thank you for coming. You can definitely find it on YouTube later. So N-O-M-P here, you could also kind of write it off to the side. Cool. All right, so we have a pretty good set of inferences. There's one more that we can make about K, which is if we carry our falling off the end inferences over, then we won't be able to put K in space 7 or in space 6 because those spaces would cause some letters to fall off the end. All right, so any questions or comments, concerns about how we diagrammed this? Okay. So we're going to go over here to our first question, which I saw a couple of answers in for. We call this type of question an orientation question. It's the type of question that generally is going to come first after you have set up a diagram. So it comes right after the rules. And it often looks like this. So it's going to ask you for like which of these would be a possible complete setup of this game. And it'll give you 5 different options. There are a couple of ways to approach a question like this. One that people sometimes do when they're first starting off is to go one answer at a time and check it against all the rules. I am not a big fan of that approach for myself just because it takes so long. So the approach that I use for orientation questions is the rule by rule approach. And that approach is where instead of starting with like answer A and trying to investigate it, I start with the rules and I use the rules to eliminate answer choices. So I would start with the first rule, J must be shown in the evening. Look at my diagram, that means 6 or 7. And I would just scan through the answer choices with just that rule in mind. And eliminate the one where J is not shown in the evening. Do the same with K and cannot be shown in the morning. So K cannot be in spaces 1 or 2. So I will scan and very quickly see that answer choice A causes some problems there. And then this rule has a lot going on. So I probably look at my little diagram of it, K before L before M. And cross off anything that doesn't follow that order. So I'm looking for KLM. This one is LKM. KLM checks out with C. MKL for D. So I'm going to end up with answer C. If you have done this process, the nice thing about it is you actually don't even need to verify answer choice C because it's definitely going to be the correct one if you use the rule by rule elimination approach. All right, let me pause there. Any questions about question number 1 there? Okay, I'm going to give you all a choice now. So it seemed like everybody had a pretty good handle on this opening question for this particular game. So if you would like to, we could continue working on this game and do questions 2 through 5. Or if you would prefer, we could move forward to a more challenging but similar game. Let me know in the chat window which would you prefer. Do you want to continue the rest of these questions for this game, or do you want to move on to a more challenging game? I have no preference. Okay. Kaylee says diagram, Johnny says no preference, so we'll go with Kaylee's request to diagram another game. Sure thing. Let me just move us ahead a little bit. Okay, so here is a new game. I encourage you to take substantial time on your diagram and take some time to try to figure out whatever inferences you can make. And when you're done with that, you can get started on question number 17 here. I'm going to give you about 4 minutes again. All right, that is 4 minutes. Go ahead and send me a chat and just let me know where you're at. If you're still working, that's okay. If you got an answer, you can let me know what answer you got. Okay, no problem, Daly. Thank you. Okay, Johnny, when you get a chance, let me know how it's going for you, but we'll go ahead and start working through this game. So let's talk first about, again, game recognition. We know that this is an ordering game because it uses the language of earlier than in all of the rules. But we also know that there's kind of an extra element to it. We have to sort of attach the label of finance, nutrition, or wildlife to each of these articles. So as we put them in order, we also need to keep track of their labels. So I'm going to set up a similar diagram to the one that we used for the last game, where I have 7 lines at the bottom. And then I'm going to use those lines for the names of my articles, but I'll also add a second row, sort of that 3-dimensional element. And this is going to be for the topics, finance, nutrition, and wildlife. Now this game is a little different than the last one because we know which articles have which topics, but we don't know where they're going to go on the number line. So the way that I would handle this is actually to kind of connect the letter to their topic off to the side. So I know that G is going to be a finance article. So I'll have the F next to that top layer and then the G next to that bottom row. And I'm going to do the same with H and J. So H is also a finance article and J is also a finance article. But then for Q, R, and S, I'll use N for nutrition. And for article Y, I'll use W for wildlife. And that will help me keep track of that information. One of the things that I find is when I do have a letter that has sort of a label attached to it that's always going to stay the same, it often helps me to sort of every time I write that letter to keep it attached. Now, one other way that people sometimes will do games like this that you may also have done is instead of using the second layer to use subscript. And in this case, because the label is always attached to the same letter, that would be totally okay. So if you prefer to handle this by writing like G with a subscript F, rather than using the second row and the labels, that would work as well. And then you'd have a single row ordering game. Okay, so let's take a look at the rules. The first rule is a type of rule that comes up, every few games or so in the LSAT where they say these two cannot be next to each other. They can't be consecutive. And what I usually use for that notation is just an XX with a line through it. I'm going to put it right next to the top line because it's the same topic that can't be covered. So for example, I can't have F and F next to each other. I can't have N and N next to each other. There is no additional W, which makes me think, this little WY combo might be a very powerful one because it can go anywhere. It's not going to, we're not going to have to worry about whether we're putting another W next to it. And it also would be handy to kind of separate out the F's, the N's from each other. I also will start thinking about how that then means G, H, and J. None of those can be next to each other. Neither can Q, R, or S. So those are going to be some implications. Then I get some rules. The next rule, which I'm just going to label rule number 1 because it's the first one that I'm kind of writing down, is S can be earlier than Q only if Q is third. This is a really tricky rule to write correctly. So I want you to check your notation very carefully. So if I have a situation where S is earlier then Q. Yeah, Johnny. Conditionals, again, hard to get through a logic game section without them. If S is earlier than Q, what do I know must be the case? Well, if S is earlier than Q, then Q must be in the third spot. So if S is before Q, then I have to have Q in 3. That also means I want to think about what we call the contrapositive, which is if I have a conditional, I can always reverse and negate that conditional, and my new statement will also be logically valid. So what this tells me here is, okay, well, if I flip this around and I say, what if Q is not in third? Well, what would I know then? Well, if Q is not in third, then S is not going to be earlier than Q. And since these are one at a time, they can't kind of stack up or anything, then that means that if Q is not in third, then Q has to come before S. So I'm able to get a decent amount of information from that rule, but it's also really easy to notate it with just like a tiny little difference from this and end up having some challenges throughout the game. So I'm going to pause for a second there, and please just let me know if you have any questions about how I notated that rule. If you're good with that, you can give me a smiley face and we'll move on. Okay, cool, thanks. All right, so then the rest of the rules are a little bit more straightforward. S has to be earlier than Y, so I can use just kind of my same S before Y notation. One thing I like to do is try to look for opportunities to connect rules together. So S shows up in rule 1 and 2, so I might add my Y here, like if S is before Q, and then it's just kind of like a side note, it's also going to be before Y. And here it's going to be before Y as well. If you find that confusing, you don't have to do that, but it is something that you could do to help make things a little more efficient. And then we have rule number 3, which is a similar type of rule, just a relative ordering rule. J is going to be before G, which is going to be before R. And that's all we get. So just like in the last game, we want to pause for a second for inferences. Remember that with ordering games, and all games really, we think about where letters must go or anywhere that they can't go. We're looking for our absolutes. So tell me in the chat, what are some inferences we can make about where these letters must go or can't go? All right, Johnny, that's an awesome start. So Johnny said J can't go in 7. Definitely. Classic falling off the end inference. Think a little bit more with that. You can do some more with this third rule. That's the right type of thinking to do. G can't go in 7? Good. Yes, Kaylee. R would fall off the end. What I usually then do is think like to the next space over. What about 6? Does that rule tell us anything about what can or cannot go in 6? J can't go in 6. Good, because if J were in 6, then G would be okay, but R would fall off the end. So if you have sort of a 3-letter string like this, you're usually going to be able to get at least 2 inferences. And you're going to be able to do that on both ends of the diagram. So on this side, I get J can't go on 6, J and G can't go on 7. I should have sort of like a mirror image of that over here with spaces 1 and 2. So take a moment to think about spaces 1 and 2 with this third rule and tell me what you can figure out. Okay, so if G were to go in 1, then J would fall off the end. And if R were to go in 1, it'd be the same. And R also can't go in 2 because we would be able to fit G before it, but not J. Nice. So notice how with this 3-letter string, I get 2 cross-offs from the first space and 2 from the last space, 1 from the second and 1 from the second to last. That pattern is going to hold up pretty much any time you have this situation with basic ordering. So try to visualize that in your head so that the next time you see this 3-letter string, you are able to kind of anticipate the right type of inferences to make. Johnny, that's such a great question. Johnny asked, what do you consider to be the most restrictive variable? And that's a really great question to ask yourself before you go into any logic games. I would say it is either Q or S. The case I would make for Q is that Q has a space restriction. So saying like in this circumstance, Q is limited to 3 or Q is not in 3 is going to be a really powerful rule. Just knowing, if is it in that one space or not is going to make a huge difference for the game. S is also very important, and the main reason for that is that it is in 2 different rules, including a very restrictive rule. So those are the 2 letters that I would kind of keep my eyes on, would be Q and S. Okay, we can make a couple more similar inferences from rule number 2 here. So S before Y means Y can't be first and S can't be last. One thing to be careful about is sometimes people are then tempted to make inferences like that with this first rule here, the S and Q rule. But I would say you shouldn't do that. You should not put cross-offs on the board for this rule. Any idea why? What is different about this rule right here? Remember, it came from this part of the rule list. What's different about it? Goes back to what Johnny said earlier. He said, oh, here come the conditionals again. Because this is a conditional rule, we don't actually know which of these scenarios is going to happen. If it's this first scenario, then we'll have like a certain set of cross-offs that come into play because of it. But if it's the second scenario, we're going to have a different set of cross-offs that come into play. And we only want to put these cross-offs down on our diagram if we're totally sure about them. We don't want to put anything on our diagram that's only going to be true half the time or only going to be true in certain circumstances. So a good kind of general rule with conditionals in logic games is to keep them off the board at first, because when you first make your diagram, you don't know if that scenario is going to come true or not. All right, so we have a diagram now. I am going to give you both a little more time to work on number 17 because it didn't sound like anyone was quite finished with it. So I'll give you about 1.5 minutes to continue your work. And if you finish early, let me know your answer in the chat. All right, that's about a minute and a half. Let's take a crack at this one. Johnny says he's thinking C. Let's check it out. So this is the same type of question that we did on that last game. It's an orientation question. We can follow the same strategy of going one rule at a time, although we may find that it's a bit more challenging in this particular game because it's a more challenging game. So if I go to the first rule, consecutive articles cannot cover the same topic as each other. This might actually be a rule that I would defer on because I think of it as kind of an invisible rule. When I look at these answer choices, I don't actually see the topics labeled, so I'm going to have to kind of think about that and add it in. And I'd like to do as little of that extra work as possible. So I'm going to save that for after I've done sort of the more straightforward rules. And then I'll come back to it. So I might actually skip all the way down to rule number 3 because I can play the LSAT on whatever terms I want to. And I think rule number 3 is a lot easier than either of the first 2 rules. So S is earlier than Y. I'm just going to check that out. S before Y, S before Y, S before Y. Ooh, okay, Y before S. I'm going to cross that one off. Cool. And then the last one checks out. Then we get our string JGR. So JGR, 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 GJR. That one does not hold up. Nice. So see, the benefit of that is like, okay, that was pretty fast and efficient. Now these harder rules, I only have to deal with them between 3 answer choices. Okay, Kaylee, thanks for the update. I see that. We'll make sure that's really clear, okay? So now I'm going to go back and deal with these 2 rules. So I'll start with the consecutive articles rules. So that means G, H, and J can't be next to each other, and also Q, R, and S can't be next to each other. I might just tackle that in chunks because that's a lot for me to hold on to in my brain at one time. So I'm going to check G, H, J. Here I have H, J, G. They're all pretty separate. J, G, H. Ooh, here G and H are right next to each other. So that gives me a clear reason to eliminate B. Kaylee, let me know if that doesn't make sense to you. And then I'm down to the last 2, and I'm going to check out this final rule. S can be earlier than Q only if Q is third. So S is before Q. That's supposed to mean Q is third, but in answer choice A, Q is in 4th. So I'm going to cross that off, and that means that my correct answer is C. Nice work, both of you. You were both either got it or were very close. Any questions on this one? Kaylee, is that making sense why B is wrong? Cool. And Johnny, you deserve that. Yay. Absolutely. That was a tough question. Okay, so we are going to dive into an even harder question. We've got the same game. So you can use the same setup, and I'll erase some of these extra marks, but I'll leave the board there. And I'll give you about a minute and a half to try this one out. Okay, it's been a couple of minutes. Just want to check in. How's it going? Kaylee, this is from practice test 68. And Johnny, yeah, absolutely. Very characteristic on a must be true question to have several that could be true. This is a really tough question. So I want to talk you through a strategy for it. And it's a great strategy to use on a lot of different questions on logic games, not just for this one. Kaylee, I think that testing the answers might actually be a little bit more time consuming on this one. So I'll show you another way. It's called framing the question. And what it means is you're going to create more than one sort of hypothetical scenario, but rather than testing the answer choices, you're going to base this off of inferences. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'll just kind of get you started, and then I'll give you a little more time to work. So usually with these types of questions where I'm given new information, I'm going to make a new quick diagram and add the information. So I'm going to put y in fourth. I wouldn't do this on my original diagram on the real test. And then add w there. Then I want to think about what I know about y. So I know that it's the only one of its kind. So I don't have to worry about like another w coming before or after. And I know that s has to come before it. That's kind of all I know. And I don't have much else to go on. So one thing that I can do is say s has to come before it. It's going to come in one of three places. I'm either going to put s with an n right here, or I'm going to put it in the second space, or I'm going to put it in the first space. And if I could just figure that out, that would be really helpful to me. So I'm going to start with that. And see if I can kind of figure out what it would mean depending on where S was. And that is framing the question. When I say this letter could go in maybe 1, 2, or 3 different places, let me just try them all out and see how it goes. So if I put, well, I'm going to go ahead and add the Y and W to each of these. And then if I'm placing S, I want to think about sort of its most relevant rule, which is going to be this one that connects it to Q. So S is either going to come before or after Q, depending on certain scenarios. So I'll look at the first one that I made. S is in space 3, which means that Q is not in space 3. So if Q is not in space 3, it has to be before S, which is going to be the case here. And I also noticed that Q is the same category. So Q is going to be before S, but it's not going to be right next to it because it would be 2 N's right next to each other. So Q is going to go here. That's a helpful start. If I go to the second one, it looks like Q could be before or after. So let me think about this. If we put the S before the Q, then the Q has to be in third. But if we put Q in third, we're going to have a problem. We're going to have an N next to an N. So that first scenario can't work. If we don't put Q in third, we have to put the Q before the S, which will put it here in 1, but we'll still have the N next to each other. So that means this scenario just doesn't work, which is helpful to know. So then I move up to the top scenario, and S is in space 1. Here, S is going to have to be before Q because it's first. So that means that Q will have to be in 3. So now I'm kind of rolling. I have one scenario where S is first and Q is third, one where Q is first and S is third. I can do a couple of things now. First, I know that in neither of these scenarios, J is third, so I can cross that one off. I also know that Q seems to be able to go in both of these places. So it looks like I could probably cross off C or D. But what I want to do now is use these 2 frames to see if I can fill out the rest of the board. What would everything else have to be if I had those 2 letters in place? So this is where I'm going to pause and give you a little time to work and see what you can do with this. And if you have questions, now is also a great time to throw them in the chat, but I'll give you about a minute or two to see if you can move forward with this. Okay, this is challenging, so I'm going to model it for you. One of the things that helps me get through on this type of game is that I have some experience with these 3D ordering games, so practice is helpful. One thing I've learned from practice is if I've got a bunch of empty spaces and it seems like my letters could kind of go everywhere, I might want to think about these, the sort of top row. I know that I can't have any two letters in a row on the top, so I can't have an N next to an N or an F next to an F. And that's going to help me a lot. I've used my only W, so what that tells me is this space needs to be an F. So I'm going to cross off an F. Now I'm down to two Fs and an N. If I think about these last three spaces, using this rule, what order are they going to have to go in for the Fs and the N? Well, I'm going to need to have an F, then an N, and then an F. That's the only way for me to kind of separate them. This is all going to be true up here on this diagram as well. I'm going to need to have an F, N, F kind of pattern. So then for both of the diagrams, I now want to think about what letters I have left and where they're going to need to go. My only N left is R, so that's something I know for sure is going to fill in this sixth space. So now I just have to think about the order of the Fs. Well, what I know about them is J has to come before G, which has to come before R. So here, that means I'm going to have J, G, R. That leaves H for the final spot. And here I'm going to have J, G, R, again, H for the final spot. And so what we'll find is that in both of these diagrams, J ends up being in second, which is how we would choose answer choice A. You can definitely see how this game is more difficult than the first one that we played. So this is a game that you would want to have more time in order to be able to solve. So you have to get strong at the easy games so that you can get through them pretty quickly so that you can then work through a harder game like this. But you can also see how framing the question is a valuable tool here for you to make inferences and solve. And again, remember, framing the question means you know a letter can go in 1, 2, or 3 places, so you go ahead and test out just those scenarios. The nice thing about it is that I only ended up having to fully complete 2 boards instead of potentially 5 if I were working through these answer choices one at a time. All right, it is about time for us to wrap up, but I can stick around for a couple minutes, Kaylee and Johnny, and just let me know if you have any questions either about this particular topic or anything else LSAT related. Johnny, I think redoing games is really helpful. If it's a game that you consider to be easy for yourself, replaying it to try to do it faster is awesome. If it's a game that you felt was challenging, then replaying it to try to make sure you retained the lessons that you learned from it is also really helpful. I would just encourage you to, when you're first redoing games, wait like a day or so. And then as you have redone the same game more often, you can kind of space that out more. The idea being like, let's say you just did this game and you learned some things from it and you want to remember them. You want to repeat that kind of like right away so that you like get your form correct. You know, it's kind of like if you just learned a new way to shoot in basketball, you don't want to be like, okay, I shot that. Now we're going to wait 2 weeks to try that again, because 2 weeks from now, you're going to totally have forgotten. You want to do it over and over again correctly. And then once you've got it, then you can say, okay, let me take a break from that and let me do it again 2 days from now. So start by doing like very immediate repetition and then start spacing it out more. Great question. Any others? All right, good. Kaylee, I'm really glad that you find them helpful. Okay, well, I am going to let you both go. Thank you so much for joining me. Best of luck with your LSAT studies.